Hello, I'm Stephen Matchett, and I'm delighted to be talking with Cameron Neylon and Tim Winkler on what is a transformative day for the way research performance is compared in Australia and around the world. Professor Neylon is from Curtin University's Open Knowledge Initiative, which worked with Leiden University's Centre for Science and Technology Studies on the new open source version of Leiden's University Research Performance Ranking. Tim Winkler's here. He's the publisher of Future Campus and writes about the new ranking and what it means for Australian universities in this week's edition. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Cameron Neylon, an open source multiple measure of research outputs strikes me as a big deal indeed. What does it do differently and what does it do better than, say, the commercial research rankings?
Yes, I think it really is a big deal, in part because it doesn't look so different to the old one. So what this means is that all of the expectations we have of ourselves as researchers, I'm a researcher on research, about reproducibility, transparency, credibility, those can really now be tested in the context of these rankings. So rather than wondering where these numbers are coming from, the data is something that's being done to you. You can really dig into it and ask questions in a different way. And if you disagree with the methodology, you can look at what would happen if you changed it. But more than that, I think there's another piece to this which is just as important, which is because the data is open and community curated, we now all have a stake in making it better. None of this data is perfect. Web of Science and Scopus data is not perfect either. But these community-owned resources, we can get in there and actually improve and curate them so that everyone benefits from that. And I think having a stake in the data, particularly in a world where AI is on everyone's minds and the data being used to train AI is on everyone's mind, I think is particularly important.
Strategically, it's going to be enormously beneficial for institutions, simply, as I said, simply because they've got much more control of what they can dig into. They're not beholden to anybody.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really key, and it's going to pose some challenges, right, in terms of the literacies required to really dig into it in detail, because this is a new world, and what was it in the past been a relatively surface level of data that you can engage with. Now you've got the opportunities to dig a lot deeper, and I think there's going to be some strategic benefits to those who can and have the capacities to dig deeper. So yeah, so in terms of the way in which a university or any institution thinks about its mission and thinks about its values and how those values are reflected in different indicators, the power to say, well, no, actually, this isn't quite right for us. We need to look at this slightly differently. And let's do that because we can. Let's benchmark ourselves differently. I think is really powerful, and particularly powerful with the kind of changes we're probably going to see coming through the Accord process as well.
And because the data is open access, you'll be able to basically come up with your own, an institution will be able to come up with its own preferred variables to search for.
Absolutely. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that later.
I should say there, we'll come back for a first take masterclass on how this all works. Tim Winkler, there's a massive data here, just obviously on the Australian system. How's it going to help, or indeed hinder, university research strategists and marketers?
I think this is a really exciting moment for both, really. Certainly strategists are going to have a field day with the information that's here. It's so many universities, probably thousands of people over the next month or two are going to be sitting down in their annual planning day, looking at a table of metrics that their university or their school or their department are going to be working towards. And some of those are going to be rankings from the other ranking systems. Now, everyone's known for some time there are shortcomings in those ranking systems, but it's been a case of, well, they're the best we have, so we're going to use that as a proxy for what we should be attaining. But I think what this really shows is that those ranking systems just aren't good enough anymore. We can't keep on chasing a catch-all tool that ranks us from 1 to 1,000, which doesn't actually get to the nuances of, are we trying to be good collaborators? Are we trying to publish a huge number of papers but not to worry too much about quality? Are we after a smaller number of papers and then chasing quality within that? There's no strategic leverage in keeping on chasing those rankings, whereas this opens the door to a whole new set of questions.
It's also part of the way open access in terms of research publishing is already changing. I mean, there's some new Koki data in a research article just out saying that I can't remember what the number is, but there's an extraordinary percentage of papers that are now published open access. I mean, there's open access and there's open access, but nevertheless, it's a hell of an improvement on them sitting behind a paywall. Cameron Neylon, just on that point, your data sources are open access. They're not Clarivate, they're not Web of Science, they're open access. Is that right?
Yeah, so we, when we started the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative, it was at a moment in time when those open data sources were really coming into their own. And we had the luxury, partly through also the support of the then Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research at Curtin, Chris Moran, now at UNE, of course, to really sit down and think hard about how we will bring those open data sources together. So we've been able to build analysis and tools that is top to bottom, publicly available data, open source code, open source processes, and indeed that paper, it's kind of fun and it's probably a nerdy thing that's not of interest to that many people. But actually what happens when Carl, my colleague who did most of the work, runs the final version to generate the paper, it's actually pressing a button to generate the entire analysis, all the graphs, and actually insert them into the text of the paper. So the whole thing is transparent and reproducible. So we've tried, again, I think for me, it's always been important that the values we have are reflected not just in the work we do or the advocacy we do, but in the way we do that work. And for us, openness, transparency, reproducibility is at the base of that.
I have no possible grasp of the math behind this. It just must be, it must be substantial.
It's well, again, there's many interesting things that happen when you're dealing with data at this scale, and you know, people talk about big data, and they mean many different things for it, but there are real challenges actually in statistical analysis. So again, for that particular paper where we looked at the diversity of incoming citations to research publications, so the diversity of incoming citations, not the counts, there's some real statistical challenges because we're looking at the whole population. We're not sampling. So in many traditional analyses, you'll see a p-value and people say, yeah, there was a significant difference. And we weren't in a position to do that for two reasons. One was it doesn't make sense when you're talking about the whole population because p-values are calculated from samples. But when we did calculate the p-values, the numbers are so big that the p-values are vanishingly small. So we had to rethink the way we made the case and marshaled the evidence to make sure that we weren't fooling ourselves, which is a real risk.
When the film comes out, probably Tom Hanks playing you, when the film comes out, is there going to be a scene where someone just runs routine analysis and all this stuff and comes up with a research spectrum for the world that no one's ever thought about?
I really hope so. I think the challenge, it's always, there's so much in this data. Yeah. There are so many stories there to be dug out and so much that you can do with it. And we're just at the beginning of what's really a groundswell change in how these things work. So I think I really hope that what we've done will enable other people to be the person in that scene. And maybe there'll be lots of scenes like that as people dig in and find the thing that really changes the way they think about their own strategy.
Look, I'm sure that's right, and I'm sure medical establishments, defence establishments, whatever, are going to be finding patterns of research and people ultimately that they just didn't know were there.
Absolutely.
That's fair. Socializing the benefits for a change. That's fantastic. Gents, we'll come back to both of you in a bit, but for a sense of just how transformative this is, Tim recorded an interview with Leyden's Ludo Waltman. I hope I've got the pronunciation right. And Lizzie Gadd from Loughborough U in the UK. She's probably one of the major research culture and bibliometric researchers worldwide. That interview runs for about 15 minutes. It's up now, but we'll be back after that for Cameron to walk us through how Open Edition works and to take questions. Goodo, Amanda Johnson, who produces, you going to throw the switch?
Ludo, let's start with you. What does this new ranking mean for Australian universities?
For Australian universities, not only for Australian universities, but also for Australian universities, this new ranking offers a level of transparency that has never been available before in terms of access to data, and therefore also the possibility to actually understand what the indicators, what the metrics, what the statistics, what they really mean. That's something that I feel we have not been able to provide before. My center has not been able to provide it before, but I believe the same applies to others. And ultimately, I think this is a starting point. This is a starting point for a transition that we will be going through, where we will become more used to actually not just blindly giving certain interpretations to all kinds of metrics and analytics and interpretations that other people tell us we should give them, but instead actually moving away from black boxes and starting to think again ourselves about what the data, what the indicators, what it really means, and hopefully thereby drawing more meaningful conclusions.
Lizzie, what do you think of this new ranking? Is it a good thing to have a new ranking, given that there are a range of issues with the existing rankings that we have?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I'll be truthful and I'll say that, I'm not a big fan of university rankings, simply because, I don't really believe that universities actually need to be ranked. I don't, there are no winners and losers. There's no kind of, it's not like there's a particular prize on offer, a job, a promotion, there's a grant funding, which are all scenarios in which you do actually need to rank entities to decide who wins. We don't need winners and losers amongst universities. We are all the best at what we are aiming to be. We all have individual missions and we're all trying to do our best to achieve those missions. But beyond that kind of philosophical point, there is the issue around the underlying data, that it's rarely reliable enough to could be confidently used to rank institutions to say definitively this institution is better than this institution, full stop, end of the matter. But I do recognise the need for high quality data about university activity so that institutions can monitor their progress on agendas that they care about and that they can identify and learn from best practice. And of course this data is available to other groups too, to scholars, to students, and so on. And the truth is that, even if that data is not provided as a ranking, and the UK Research Excellence Framework outcomes as a classic example here, if it's provided in numerical form, it will soon end up as a ranking, because the HE sector is competitive. There is, I say there's no winners and losers. There are a finite number of students, and we all want our share of them. And institutions will latch on to any positive differences and trumpet them in their marketing. So rankings won't disappear. And if we're going to have them, let's have some good ones. Let's have those that adhere to community principles. So I work with the iNorms Research Evaluation Group, developed some ranker ratings that we sourced some principles for good university assessment from the community, and we assessed how the existing ranking agencies measured up against those principles, and all fell short. CWTS did a lot better than some of the others, let me just say. So it's always been one of, if not the best of the bunch, because it doesn't claim to identify the best university in the world using composite indicators. It's honest about uncertainty of the outcomes. It seeks to measure what matters to institutions, such as openness and gender gaps. And of course, it's no longer based on proprietary data sources that inherently favour the global north. So that's all good stuff.
But perhaps I could add here something from the CWTS point of view, because actually also in my team, we have quite ambivalent feelings about rankings. And yes, indeed, also our own tool is a tool that we present as a ranking. And that's indeed where we do have these ambivalent feelings. In some sense, you could actually question whether our ranking is really a ranking, because it's actually a multidimensional tool that offers a diversity of perspectives. It can be used to rank, but you don't need to use it in that way. So for instance, in addition to lists, we also provide alternative ways of looking at the data, more visual ways. So far, what we have chosen to do is to actually still label it as a ranking, even though that label might not be fully appropriate, but it's a way for us to actually make sure that our ranking, I still use the term, gets the attention that we feel it deserves compared to all these other tools that also call themselves rankings and that we think have all these problems that Lizzie also just mentioned, and where we also believe we offer a better alternative.
I've often thought that actually that Leiden should be called Leiden rankings, not ranking, because you don't offer this definitive single view of institutional quality. And yes, maybe in future CWTS Leiden ratings might be a better moniker for you. But I understand why you use the term, absolutely.
So Ludo, are you hopeful that institutions will use your rankings rather than other rankings to inform their strategy going forwards?
What we see is already, even before this transition that we are now going through, our rankings are being used, in particular in certain countries, with actually your country, Australia, being one of those. And of course, that is kind of, it's nice to see that. At the same time, and it also applies to the Leiden ranking, we need to keep in mind what the ranking really kind of tells you and also what it doesn't tell you. And I only would like people to use my ranking or rankings if indeed that makes sense in the specific context in which they are operating. So for instance, if you have a university that as part of its mission has as one of its key priorities to improve the extent to which it is collaborating internationally in the research it's doing, then actually one of those indicators that we offer in the ranking, the share of internationally co-authored publications, might be indeed quite relevant. And I would feel good about a university using my ranking to kind of benchmark the performance they have on that particular aspect of international collaboration. But other universities have different missions, and they should not actually make use of my ranking or not make use of that particular indicator because it doesn't make sense for them. What you often see indeed also, for instance, in the way the ranking is being used, being discussed, not only by universities, but also news media, people use these things like, oh, I'm number one, I'm in the top 10, etc. But actually, it doesn't make sense in the case of Leiden ranking. And actually, you're showing kind of ignorance, institutions that use that language, kind of ignorance of what the Leiden ranking is really trying to do. So if you are number one, or if you are in the top 10 on a particular dimension that really matters to you, then it's perfectly fine to be proud of that, to advertise that, but pay attention. It should really match with your particular mission, your particular context, and all of that.
Is this going to take on? Is it going to be a ranking that's regarded as highly as other rankings? I
think it is fair to say that, currently due to the marketing heft of the big three commercial university rankings, they are the ones that tend to be used by governments, by funders to wrongly, in my view, make decisions about who's funded, who gets visas in the UK's case. So there is, whilst those imperatives exist and they coalesce around the big commercial rankings, the other better ranking systems are going to have less visibility and less weight. But I think the world is moving. There's a huge shift towards responsible research assessment now. All universities in England, to get funding from Research England, they have to commit to responsible research assessment practices, for example, and therefore that we have to then weigh up our principles, our commitments and our agreements with funders with our activity, and we need to think, well, actually, can we both honestly say that yes, we are assessing responsibly, and using rankings that may not assess responsibly, might be embedding inequities and using flaky methods to make poor decisions. Are those two positions compatible? And I think we're at that point now, and we're seeing even student groups challenging their provosts to say, actually, we don't think this is actually serving us as students anymore, because it's not fair that we are judged by the institution that we studied at. And so even students are recognising that, which will be another really powerful lever, I think. So will this make a difference? Yes, it will. I mean, the existence of the CWTS Leiden ranking is absolutely critical, because as we start recognising the limitations of the global university rankings, the inevitable question will be, what shall we use instead? And without something in existence that we could use instead, that is aligned around open data and positive principles, robust methods, we can't kind of make that shift towards better forms of university assessment. So it's important that it exists. It will make a difference in the long run. It'll be a journey to get there. The existence of the ranking itself is not going to change the world overnight.
Is your new ranking going to be a tool that is of great value to governments or not?
It really always applies. I think the answer is context dependent. It really depends on what governments see as their priorities. So I think that some of the aspects that we provide in the ranking, some of the dimensions that we cover, so it is citation impact, it is collaboration, it's also gender diversity, it's also open access publishing. Some of these dimensions align quite well with indeed major issues being discussed in science policy. So there we do have indeed alignment with things that, at least in certain countries, are government priorities. But at the same time, we need to recognize there are lots of other government priorities for which at the moment we simply haven't found a good way to capture them using the type of data that my ranking is based on, bibliometric data. And there I would actually urge governments not to make use of my ranking, because we simply don't have the data, the indicators to actually help them shape their policies. So that's the honest story that I think we as ranking producers need to actually tell governments and other stakeholders in the system. Well, the key thing that is missing in all ranking systems is the educational dimension. So my ranking is very explicit about it. It's simply not within the scope of what we are trying to do. We are not experts in that space. Other rankings take a much more, I would say, ambiguous position. They make claims about kind of being able to provide insight into not only research, but also educational performance. And it's really questionable whether they are actually able to fulfill these claims they're making. So that's, I think, quite problematic. But this is where at the moment we are all kind of struggling to find ways to actually obtain data that can really inform students and other stakeholders. Another dimension that is difficult is the societal impact of what we are doing in the university system. It's of course of huge importance, but it's not so easy to capture. And what I think we will see, and my own organization might also contribute to this, we will, I think, more and more see a movement where actually what rankings and other types of benchmark tools will provide in terms of information is not so much direct evidence that tells you how a university is performing in terms of the education it offers or in terms of societal impact. But actually, I think what we will more and more see is the extent to which universities in their policies, in their way of working, actually show a commitment to, for instance, realizing societal impact. So at that level, I think we have still significant opportunities to more information and to do better in terms of making that information available and informing policy debates.
Tim, could I just come in on that point around educational quality? Because I think this is a huge irony that the rankings are largely used by students to identify universities to study at. But the one thing that they do not measure in any meaningful way is educational quality or learning outcomes. Because, you know, how do you actually assess educational quality? Even as an institution, we would struggle with that. You know, we certainly don't use indicators that are used by the rankings, i.e. how many alumni do we have that have Nobel Prizes. You know, so it's hugely difficult to assess educational quality in a quantitative way. So it's never largely going to end up in university rankings. But I think the point that we sometimes miss in these conversations around rankings is that, you know, especially they're used by students, is that students are not using these rankings because they you know, to identify the best university to study at. They're using these rankings to identify the university that other people think will be the best university to study at. So that when they go into the marketplace, the job marketplace, they will be well perceived and well received. So I think that's something we can't ignore. That's, you know, what we think these rankings are actually measuring may or may not actually ultimately matter to those communities that we're expecting to use them in that way. They might be using them in a completely different way, kind of tapping into the kind of prestige ecosystem. But
that's a great point. And so I guess that that poses the last question that I was going to ask you, which is, do you think the launch of the first replicatable a rankings system is the beginning of the end for unrepresentative rankings?
I think the existence of a better ranking will not in and of itself replace other rankings, certainly overnight, and certainly those that have huge commercial heft that are already so embedded in government and university policy all over the world. You know, we're not a fast-moving sector, and it's going to take a long time to turn this oil tanker round. But as I mentioned earlier, you know, without decent alternatives to existing rankings, we're never going to be able to shift away from the damaging, unappointed, unaccountable commercial agencies. So I think the CWTS ranking is really, really important in that respect. But there will need to be this concurrent piece of work by actors in the sector, and we're seeing many calls for this, which we should all be very encouraged by, you know, to call out the limitations of the existing rankings and to engage more critically with them and to highlight these alternatives.
I think on top of these things that Lizzie mentioned and that I can only agree with, but what is also going to happen, what I expect to happen is availability of data will only increase, and openness of that data will, I believe, also increase. That's so essential, and that's increasingly being recognized. Data will become more interoperable, so it will become more and more easy to actually combine data from different sources. So what I expect to happen is we will see more and more actors in the system that will actually just start producing rankings, because it's going to be relatively easy in the future to do so. And lots of these actors will perhaps create rankings that don't really make sense, that have all kinds of flaws, and they will make mistakes. Some of them will do highly innovative things, and they will actually do things that might actually make my ranking less relevant in the future. But the key point perhaps is that in a world in which we have so many actors that are all able to make their own rankings, to share them globally, we will in some way, we will actually force people to think more carefully about what they're using, because there will be so many things out there that actually the dynamics of the reputation game that Lizzie was also referring to, will kind of change. And I expect that ultimately we are going to push people in the direction of thinking more carefully about what they use, how they interpret it. How exactly that will play out is really difficult to predict. But I think we're moving in that direction. So in that sense, I'm optimistic.
I think we're out on that high note. Yep, we're out. Can I bring a question that I should have asked before, Cameron Neylon, that came out of that was, how far down can you go right down to 6-digit research codes?
So I guess two answers to that question. One is, and I will show you this in a bit, you can go down to the actual outputs themselves.
Yep.
Because that data is now available. The way that one of the important methodological details of the way the Leiden ranking works is they use a broadly objective means of clustering outputs into, well, what they call clusters. So they don't use the field of research codes that are commonly used in Australia. They have a set of roughly 4,000 categories that they use as the basis for normalizing citation counts and other things. And so, yes, and then all of that data is also available. And what's interesting about that and what that opens up is the possibility to map those 4,000 clusters, which are rigorously produced, onto a different categorization, like, for instance, the fields of research. Yep. Or indeed, for those of the audience thinking about TEXA accreditation, the fields of education, right? So when we built a model of the ERA process that was going to run, and we've generated based on the journal list. So we classified outputs based on the journal list, and that allowed us to calculate what the results might have looked like for ERA 23. We've also, with some help from the University of New England, map those onto fields of education, specifically to try and support evidence for TEXA accreditation. But now we can both rerun that entire analysis using the Leiden clusters, which obviously have some credibility, but we can also go back the other way and use that as the basis for classifying outputs into fields of research, and that's a piece of work we would like to look at doing. And again, there's a technical nerdy thing around. Everyone at the moment is talking about using machine learning to do automated classification to fields of research. I have concerns about that as an approach. That's a longer conversation, but I think there's an opportunity to do a better job here.
There are three questions that come out of that. One is methodologically, how confident are you going to be that you make the links from the from the two or three sources? I hear people with arcane complaints 10 years down the time saying they've been done wrong because they confused exercise science with biomechanics.
Yep. So again, there's sort of a range of answers to that. So again, the actual queries that CWTS used to do the analysis, as well as the data, they're all available. If you want to shift papers from 4013 to 4016 in either our ERA modelling or in from one cluster to another in terms of the Leiden ranking, you can run that analysis and see how big a difference it makes. And because the data is available, because it's built, again, on a transparent methodology, you can rerun it. So one of the interesting things about the Open Leiden ranking, they haven't just done it for 2023. They've actually looked at rerunning what would have been done last year and the year before and the year before that and the year before that as a way of comparing with the traditional Leiden ranking. So all of this again, in contrast to, I mean, again, we had two sort of very excitable moments in the media about Australian university rankings last year, going up in THE and down in QS, whichever way round it was. Both of those were basically noise. There wasn't really any change in performance. There was a change in the methodologies being used to do that ranking, but that change was opaque, and there's no way of checking whether year to year there was any real change in performance. With these systems, it's a presumption that you will, if you make a change, you should always still do it the way you used to do it and do it the way you're now doing it and do what you are now doing for the data from last year. And then you can check, then everyone's in a position to make a judgment about how that change affects them and what it really means.
Questions coming in, but I've still got my other two, which I want to ask first. If, just hypothetically speaking, if some sort of agency, national agency that measured research performance, just hypothetically, if they decided that this would be a way to cost effectively rank not so much institutions but by disciplines, what I'm hearing is that's something entirely possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also speaks actually to the question Michelle Durier has raised around existing information resources. So the power here is not in taking this data and reprocessing it the same way or running the same analysis. The power is in saying, okay, in our context in Australia, we are, for instance, concerned about the fields of research. Let's make sure we reanalyze that in those terms and think through what that means. Or, we're particularly interested in how this relates to reconciliation, and we've made the effort to think about Indigenous knowledge in those fields of research codes. Those are completely missing from many international classification systems. We would need to do culturally credible and Indigenous-led work to define how those systems would be put together, what those classifications would look like, what would be sensible means of analysis. And that can only be done in Australia, and it can only be led by Indigenous Australians. And so that's where the possibilities arise. And so things like the national PID graph, the effort that's gone into collecting data up together that exists that is relevant to Australia is incredibly powerful because we can interconnect it, because we can quickly move from one thing to another. Again, one of the things I've done in the last day, I only had this data since 9 o'clock yesterday morning, is gone through and connect the outputs up to things like their titles and other things, so we can look through at the output level. And we can do that because of these persistent identifiers. And again, that's one of the stories of why this data is so powerful, is connecting these things together.
Very, very quickly, because people are now starting to say, well, show us how to use the data. But very quickly, is there enough data out there at a national level, say, to translate this to measures of student quality? I mean, if the Quilt people just gave you all the data, not that they're necessarily going to, could you overlay that with, I don't know why you'd want it, but could you overlay that with research output?
You certainly can at the university level. That's a question of the granularity of data that's available. So again, as a sort of parallel example, not exactly that, but I looked at the size of the block grants to Australian universities versus the parameters that are coming out of the Leiden ranking at the level of the university, because that's the level we have that data at. I can connect those two things up and make sense of it. I think to that question, and I see that question from Tom Worthington as well, around that keeps coming up about measuring education quality. For me, and others may disagree, but for me, I think it's not really clear to me that trying to measure something as complicated as educational quality internationally necessarily makes sense. It's something that really ought to be done in a national context or within a system context.
Well, the Europeans might argue with that. I mean,
some would agree with me and some would disagree with me. But yes, there are very different systems, and they're focused very much on mobility as well. So there's definitely an argument to be had there. This question of granularity is really important. So teasing apart what level does it make sense to go to, and which data sets can be combined sensibly. There's a literacy question here to be addressed. So
show us how you use it.
Okay, let me guess. So I can see Leona's question as well. So let me show you a few things and the route to various pieces of information. I think I've got this right. So this is the front page of the open edition of the Leiden ranking. This will be familiar to anyone of you who's looked at the Leiden ranking website in the past. It is in fact the same website with the new data put in it. So this default view, and then the ability to pick your indicators and look at different ways of ordering things. So again, to Lizzie and Ludo's point, I'm not going to obsess about who's 1 and who's 2. If you're interested in doing a comparison, if you're interested in how the data in this version of the Leiden ranking compares to the previous one, to the traditional Leiden ranking with Web of Science data, they've provided this tool which allows you to compare the 2 results. So here I'm showing just for Australia using fractional counting, the number of outputs in the top 10% by citation, normalized citation counts. And again, to that point, you don't just get to look at how this year compares to the traditional ranking. You can actually go back into the past and look at how those comparisons would have looked had this thing been running for the last 5 or 10 years. So that question of what's the process, what's the pace of change, is also something you can dig into. Benchmarks, what does that underlying trend line look like? I think the other interesting thing I just wanted to point out here again, that point about rankings. So if you want to think of this as an Australian ranking, to read off what the old Web of Science ranking would have looked like, you need to read from right to left. So Melbourne top, followed by Sydney, followed by UNSW. But if you want to look at what the ranking, if you want to force it into a single ranking for the new edition, then the order's slightly different, right? Melbourne, Sydney, Monash, then UNSW, despite the fact that you can see the data's almost identical, right? So the change is very little, but these rankings have forced us into these artificial situations where these are zero-sum games that when insignificant differences look as though they're changes in position. To Leonie's question, what I'll do is I'll point you to this blog post on the CWTS site. If you go to cwts.nl, I can put these links in the chat later. There's a lot of detail here about where you can find the data, where you can get at it. There are 2 places you can get at the data itself. One of those is on, I'll just find where it is. So down in this section is on Zenodo. So you can download the whole data set, which is quite big, quite works. And then if you can also access that data set through Google BigQuery if that's a tool that you're using to do analysis. And that's in fact what I did to play with some processing. So all of this is, I guess, looking at the data as it is, looking at rankings. But what I really want to do is show you what we can actually do with it. So here's some things I pulled together over the last day. Specifically looking at Australian outputs. So again, to that question, so I happen to disagree with the folks at CWTS on some of the classification of open access types. We have done a lot of work on open access, so we have our own classification. So we've reanalyzed the open access data specifically to fit our definitions. We can do that because we have access to the papers. We can obviously dig into various things. We can also look at, this is actually showing all of the outputs from Australia that contribute to the Leiden ranking, but we could look, for instance, at just the most recent one.
Let me just ask that when you say open, as opposed to publisher open just means what used to be called green.
So in fact, that's why we have a difference of definitions. So in our work, we always talk about the different routes by which something is available. So something can be available both through the publisher website, and it can also be available through other platforms like repositories, PubMed Central, and other places. And so we like to make it clear that things can be available through both pathways. Or one or the other. So hence the sort of Venn diagram. And then that overall is the number of things that are accessible. So again, to your earlier point,
that's total open.
That's total things that you can get to access freely on the web. Is 55%. 4 things included in this most recent version of the Leiden ranking which is that 2018 figure. But again, because we've got access to the data, we can do so, and I'll actually, because the time graph isn't very interesting, if I just show 1 year, let's show everything. We can dig into looking at those different categories of impact. So this is by output. So you know this is a nice graph showing that across this theoretical run of multiple editions of the Leiden ranking, Australia's citation performance as a whole has been generally improving, with more included in these top categories than below, and outperforming benchmarks. So more than 50% of our work is in the top 50%. Around 2% of our work is in the top 1%. So that's showing, you know, that Australia has a concentration quality overall. But we can also do things like, well, we can obviously select a specific university and look, say, at just the University of Sydney over time. I have no idea what's going to come up here. I have no story to tell. It was just, you know, I picked Melbourne on another time that I ran through this. But we could also just pick things that are only collaborative, for instance. And so we've got this ability to dig into the data and say, okay, well, is collaborative work higher impact by these indicators than single institution? And again, this one's the fun one to some extent. So we can connect this data up with other data sources. There's nothing in the Leiden ranking data about ARC funding. But I have data from another source that lets us connect things to whether there's an acknowledgement of ARC funding in those research outputs. So I can dig in and say, okay, well, let's just look at the ARC funded stuff and ask some questions around, again, is that, as you would expect, generally higher impact? And the answer is, yeah, generally. The effects are subtle, but, you know, those things that are ARC funded tend to have higher impacts. But again, we're not stuck with asking questions about overall numbers. These are the outputs. These are the actual outputs that are contributing to these scores. And so, you know, if I click on one of these, I should really try and click on one that's open access, because I'm not actually on a VPN with library access. But yeah, here we go. Here's a paper. This should be ARC funded. It should be from the University of Sydney, and it should have a fairly substantial number of citations, because that's how I've ordered it. So then, you know, we could also look at, there's collaborations. So again, these are all of those, you know, 900,000 outputs. And we have data not just on the collaborations with other institutions, but also other universities, but also other institutions. So again, we can look at, are you particularly interested in collaborations with government? Are you particularly interested in collaborations with civil society? You can dig into those things and ask some of those questions. And again, oh, good, this one. Because we can connect the data up, we can ask questions about, okay, well, who's funding the research that's being included? And again, slice and dice it based on who's funding it. This graph needs a little bit of adjustment, because obviously you might have more than one funder for a single output. So I'm sort of double counting a few things here. But, you know, again, it makes the point that we can connect these data sources up, which is it's a whole new level of being able to ask questions about, is our best work coming from big grants? Is it coming perhaps from small scale innovative work, which is doing the real breakthrough stuff? One of the interesting things is the highest ranked papers, most of them they're important papers, but they're not what I would call breakthrough papers. They're things where there was a big project, it reported, it was important. I think that's kind of interesting as well, that, again, you've got to ask some questions about what it is we're privileging here. And then as finally, so just again to demonstrate sort of connecting up of outputs, what I've done here is I've taken, again, from the DOA website, I grabbed the block funding data, again, over time. So all I'm just showing, again, for those of you who worry about details, this is the total column from the block funding spreadsheet you can download from the Department of Education. And I'll colour these by the grouping. So orange is a GO8, unsurprisingly more money, unsurprisingly more outputs in that top 10% category. And that's a volume effect in part. And so what's, I think, interesting is if we go down and rather than looking at just the number of outputs in the top 10%, we ask about the intensity, if you like, or the proportion of outputs in the top 10% for each university. It tells a kind of interesting story. And I think, for me, the breakout story here is ACU, which I think, as Tim noted in his news piece, if you look at the proportion of outputs in that top 10%, comes out on top in Australia. Okay, that's maybe not what various people expect, but it's very consistent. And it's been there's a story here over time. If we track back through time, this is ACU 2018, 2017, 2016. There's something going on here that isn't just noise. That's a shift in the way ACU, and indeed another example of this is UTS, which to me are kind of standout examples of something shifting and something changing in terms of the intensity of that highly cited research. And I think in the context,
a couple of questions that they're beyond my capacity.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
Yep. Well, Ralph Wilden's asking about aggregation, that it's social sciences and humanities rather than drilling down to business and management. Is that correct?
Yes. So in terms of the way these, and again, actually, Leonie's question speaks to this as well about dashboard availability. So the data itself goes right down to those 4,000 clusters. Now you'd have to reprocess that yourself and do that analysis and pick out which ones of those you are interested in terms of business and management versus media studies. But the data is there if that's what you want to do. It's a question of processing it and being able to do that. So it's
that data will be sitting on a site, and people.
So it's available both through BigQuery and on that Zenodo website. Yep.
It's a hell of a thing. And then somebody else is asking about citation impact analysis. And that their point is that traditionally citations have been assumed to be of equal weight, and asks, can the methods that you use gain deeper insights into the knowledge impact of a publication?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I glossed over, and it's an important point, is you will have seen in a few places there's a tick box that asks whether you're doing fractional counting. Let's stop sharing for the moment. So what SID or TS do is they aim to distribute a publication amongst the institutions that were involved in its publication. So rather than everyone getting to take all the citations or all the credit, they try and distribute that. And that's important with papers with thousands of authors, obviously thousands of authors and sometimes hundreds of institutions. So those are options for analysis. We have also, again, our recent paper on citation diversity gives us a different indicator for citation impact. And it's entirely possible for us to take away the citation count data that SID/TS used and drop in our indicator and say, okay, well, this is a different measure. If the diversity, and by diversity we mean, so how many different institutions are citing you, how many different countries are citing you, versus, you might have 1,001 citations, but if they all come from the same place or the same person, then that's not as meaningful as 1,000 citations from different places and different people. So there's everything to play for here. All of this is possible, and really in-depth analysis is possible. If you have a different indicator that can be calculated across a set of outputs, then it can be applied. And you can ask those questions, and you can rerun the benchmarks and do all of those things.
Are there measures that you haven't thought of, you reckon?
Oh, absolutely.
Start looking for?
Yeah, I think there's a whole wealth of, I mean, we think about collaboration, right? So think about the needs of the Australian sector. So we've got a changing world environment where we've done very well out of resources. We want to think about how we build a knowledge economy for the 21st century. We need strength in depth. We need, but also breadth to deal with unexpected things. You know, there's always a story, whether it was the pandemic or 9/11. There's always a story about the person whose grant was pushed back the day before because yesterday it wasn't important, but now it is. And so we have to be imaginative about thinking about the kinds of indicators we might want, but just thinking about collaboration and asking questions, okay, well, what about the density of your collaborations with the local area? Everyone's obsessed about international collaborations, but if you're a rural university deeply embedded in a local community, maybe you're really interested in the depth and strength of your collaborations with the local community and perhaps the economic impact that has. How do we do that? I don't know off the top of my head, but it's worth thinking about. And so, yeah, absolutely. The potential for the creativity is huge. And I very much hope if the only things we have are things I can think of, that's a pretty boring world.
Tim, has the paradigm shifted?
Yeah, I think so. I think, I mean, this is a discussion that should be a day rather than an hour. And we've had a number of questions through, and we're getting some inquiries behind the scenes with people saying, you know, how can we dig into this deeper? I think we'll need to have a chat with Cameron after this to look at how we can, you know, provide some opportunities to dig in deeper for each institution. In the meantime, though, I think it is a paradigm shift for two reasons. One is councils. Every executive reports to a council, and every council wants to know how their university is performing. For the first time, there is a completely transparent index which starts to tell them a few measures and in a few dimensions about how they're performing. Clearly taking it on board about education is not in there, but other things are. Secondly, research funders. It gives them a tool to say, well, what am I funding? What's the bang for buck out of the money we just spent on research last year? Is it high quality or high output? So the number of questions that we start to get out of this data and the ability to manipulate it makes it a seismic shift in where we can go from here.
What's next, Cameron, with what you've got?
Well, I hope what's really next is people digging into the data and asking questions and finding issues. I think, again, I really want to highlight this data is not perfect. We're just scratching the surface here. And the audience are the people who are experts around what's happening in their institutions. So as you dig in, you will find things you didn't expect. You will find potentially issues. There are opportunities to correct data where it's wrong and fix those issues. So I think that's a really important thing. And then in broader terms, what we're hoping to do with CWTS is really provoke an international conversation about the literacies, the infrastructures we need to do this well, and to really put institutions in charge of the stories they are telling about themselves. Because as Lizzie very eloquently says, this is really about the fact that institutions have different purposes, different missions, different values, and we need to live those values and express those missions from top to bottom. From, you know, it's one thing to have those aspirational statements in an annual report, but you've really got to live those values right the way through to how you think about measuring yourself and evaluating whether you're achieving your goals.
It's a hell of a thing. Look, it's parenthetical and not the right way to close, but just let me ask, this is all based on open access data. This is not based on Clarivate or Web of Science. I mean, that in itself is a hell of a thing. Do you want to talk a little bit of where that data now comes from?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we publish research. A lot of effort goes into making the data around that research, and traditionally that was captured by largely proprietary indexes, abstracting services, and those are things that turned into Web of Science and Scopus and similar things. What's happened over the last 25 years has been a really huge investment in community infrastructures, things like Crossref, DataCite, Open Citations, that have worked to collect and collate that metadata in a way that supports everyone for wider use. Now, that data is not complete. It doesn't have all the things you need. So there's another layer needed on top of that. And folks like OpenAlex bring those data sets together, and then will also scrape or aggregate information as well to build these bigger data sources. And then, of course, we need the services to translate that data to make it usable and practical. And then, yeah, what we've done today is an example of that. If I can leave the audience with anything, it's the idea that this is community data. This is data about us, and it's nothing about us without us. This is something we have a stake in, and so it's our data, and it's a thing that we need to engage with and be a part of, because otherwise it will just continue to be something that's done to us and not something that's done with us.
That's a hell of a way to close. Cameron Neylon, Tim Winkler, thank you very much for doing this. It's just extraordinary. Cheers me up at the beginning of the year. I hope we come back. I hope we do it again. I hope we do it again soon. Thank you, gentlemen, and we're out.